What a child wishes for in moments of terror may not serve the man he becomes. Sometimes the sanctuary we beg for in youth becomes the prison that destroys us in adulthood. Tonight's tale has us straining to see through the fog, but only finding a glimpse into madness. The fog rolled through the industrial district like smoke from a funeral pyre, thick and gray and suffocating. Lionel Cates pressed his back against the cold brick wall, listening to the sirens wail in the distance. His heart hammered against his ribs. His hands still trembled. 30 seconds, that's all it was supposed to take. In and out of the jewelry store, smash the cases, fill the bags, run to the car. But plans have a way of turning to ash when you least expect it, and now Tommy Brennan lay bleeding on the sidewalk 6 blocks away with a bullet in his chest. Lionel's bullet. He could still hear Tommy's voice, pleading through gritted teeth. "Don't leave me, Lionel. Please don't leave me." But Lionel had made his choice, quick and clinical. One shot to keep Tommy quiet forever. The man would have talked under interrogation, would have given up names, would have dragged them both down. It was mercy, Lionel told himself as he slipped through the shadows. A kindness. The abandoned building rose before him like a monument to forgotten ambitions. Half factory, half office tower, it had been gutted by bankruptcy and time. Perfect place to disappear for a few hours. Let the heat die down. Let the sirens fade. Lionel shouldered open the rusted door and stepped into darkness. The lobby stretched before him, filled with the detritus of collapse, broken tiles, twisted metal, the skeleton of what had once been an information desk. Moonlight filtered through shattered windows, casting everything in silver and shadow. He found a corner behind an overturned filing cabinet and slumped against the wall. 52 years old and still running. Still hiding, still taking what didn't belong to him. But he'd never hurt anyone before tonight. That had always been his rule, his code. Break into houses when the families were away, crack safes in empty offices, keep it clean, keep it simple. Never leave a victim who could look him in the eyes and remember until tonight. The silence settled around him like a shroud. No sirens now. No footsteps. Just the sound of his own breathing and the distant drip of water somewhere in the darkness. It's almost peaceful in here, he thought. No cops, no noise, no one looking. If I could stay hidden forever, he shook the thought away. Dangerous thinking. Weak thinking. He'd wait until morning, then slip out through the loading dock he'd spotted on his way in. Find a fence for the jewelry. Disappear into another city, another name, another life. That's when he saw the boy. Small figure seated cross-legged on the cracked lobby floor, maybe 9 or 10 years old. Pale skin. Mop of dark curls that caught the moonlight. Clothes dirty, but not ragged. And eyes that held a clarity that didn't belong on a child's face. The boy looked up at him and smiled. "Hello, Lionel." Lionel's hand moved instinctively toward the pistol tucked in his jacket, but something stopped him, the voice. Soft and familiar and impossibly calm. "How do you know my name?" The boy tilted his head, a gesture so familiar it made Lionel's chest tighten. "You told me I was your best friend. Did you forget?" The words hit Lionel like a physical blow. He stared at the pale face, the dark curls, the strange mix of warmth and judgment in those young eyes. It couldn't be. It was impossible. But the voice? "Benny?" The boy's smile widened. "You remember." Lionel's legs gave out. He slid down the wall until he was sitting on the cold floor, staring across the lobby at a ghost from his childhood. Benny had been his only friend during those dark years, his only comfort when his stepfather's rage turned violent, his only companion when his mother disappeared into bottles and men and excuses. Benny had lived in the silence between heartbeats, in the space under the bed where Lionel would hide, in the darkness of the closet where small boys went to disappear. "I wish I could vanish," 8-year-old Lionel had whispered into that darkness. "Then I'll go with you," Benny had always answered. But that was 44 years ago. Benny wasn't real, had never been real. Just the desperate invention of a lonely, frightened child. "You're not here," Lionel said, his voice barely above a whisper. Benny stood and walked closer, his footsteps echoing in the empty space. "I'm wherever you need me to be." He settled down beside Lionel, close enough that the man could smell something sweet and familiar. Burnt cinnamon. Like the kitchen on the morning his mother left for good. They sat in silence for a long moment. Then Benny began to hum. a soft, lilting melody that made Lionel's throat close with unexpected emotion. His mother's lullaby, the one she'd sung before the drinking got bad, before the men started staying over, before she stopped looking at him like he mattered. "Why are you here?" Lionel asked. Benny stopped humming. "You called me." "I didn't call anyone. You did. In the alley. When you pulled the trigger." Benny's voice took on a harder edge, older, more knowing. "You wished you could disappear, just like before." Lionel closed his eyes. The memory was there, sharp as broken glass. Tommy bleeding on the pavement, the sirens getting closer. The moment of decision when mercy and murder became the same thing. And yes, in that heartbeat before he squeezed the trigger, he had wished. Desperately. Completely. "Let me vanish. Let me be invisible. Let me disappear." "But you never do," Benny said quietly. "You never disappear. You just run somewhere else and do it all again." Lionel opened his eyes. The boy was watching him with an expression that belonged on an adult's face. Disappointment mixed with something that might have been pity. "I survive," Lionel said. "That's what matters." Benny tilted his head again. "Is it?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Lionel didn't answer. Couldn't answer. Instead, he pulled out a flask from his jacket and took a long drink. The whiskey burned, but it was a good burn. A real burn. When he looked up, Benny was studying the walls around them. In the moonlight, Lionel could see crude chalk drawings scattered across the brick and concrete. A red wagon. A broken swing. A small figure huddled in a closet. "Did you do that?" Lionel asked. "They were always here," Benny said. "You just had to look." Lionel stared at the drawings. They told a story he'd tried to forget. A lonely boy who started stealing coins from his stepfather's wallet, not because he needed the money, but because he hoped someone would notice. Someone would care enough to stop him, but no one ever did. "I should go," Lionel said, struggling to his feet. "The cops," Benny interrupted him. "They're not coming." Something in Benny's tone made Lionel freeze. "What do you mean?" "Look outside." Lionel cautiously approached the front doors. He pushed them open and stepped into nothing. Fog stretched in every direction, thick and impenetrable. No streets, no buildings, no city at all. Just gray emptiness that seemed to swallow sound and light and hope. For a moment he was 8 years old again, lost in a department store, calling for his mother while strangers walked past without seeing him. The panic was immediate and total. He stumbled backward into the building, slamming the doors behind him. Benny was waiting. "You always get scared at that part," the boy said casually. "What's happening to me?" "You're right where you always said you wanted to be." Lionel's hands shook as he reached for his flask again. Empty. "This isn't real," he said. "None of this is real." He shook his head in disbelief. "Does it matter?" The question echoed in the silence. Lionel sank into a corner trying to make sense of what was happening. Hallucination. That had to be it. Stress and guilt and 40 years of bad choices finally catching up with him, but the cold floor felt real beneath him. And Benny felt more real than anything else in his life. "Tell me about the wagon," the boy said suddenly. Lionel's blood went cold. "What wagon?" Benny pointed to one of the chalk drawings. A small boy pulling a red wagon loaded with stolen treasures, coins and jewelry and small precious things that didn't belong to him. "You were 6, Benny said. "First time you took something that wasn't yours. A silver dollar from Mr. Patterson's desk. You put it in the wagon and pulled it around the backyard pretending it was pirate treasure." Lionel's voice cracked. "That was just playing." "Was it?" The memories came flooding back. The thrill of taking something forbidden, the secret joy of having something that was his alone. The way his heart raced when his stepfather asked about the missing dollar and he looked right into the man's eyes and lied. "I don't know where it went." And his stepfather had believed him, had patted his head and called him a good boy. That was the moment Lionel learned that lies could be armor, that theft could be power, that disappearing could be a choice. "You taught me that," Lionel whispered. "No," Benny said, and his voice was Lionel's own voice now, rough with age and bitter with experience. "You taught yourself. I just watched." Lionel tried to sleep, but every time he closed his eyes, he saw Tommy Brennan's face, heard the man's last words, felt the weight of the trigger beneath his finger. When he opened his eyes, his stolen goods were arranged in a circle on the floor, jewelry and watches glittering in the moonlight, surrounded by small handprints pressed into the dust. "Did you do this?" Lionel asked. Benny shrugged. You did it last time too, Lionel frowned. Last time? But Benny was already walking away, humming that same lullaby. The melody seemed to come from the walls themselves now, echoing through the empty building like a hymn. Lionel scrambled to his feet and followed, but the boy was gone, vanished into shadows that seemed deeper than shadows had any right to be. He found himself at the stairwell, staring down into darkness. His head pounded, and somewhere in the distance he could hear knocking. Soft at first, then louder, coming from inside the walls. Thump, 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 like small fists beating against the other side of reality. Lionel ran. He burst through the front doors again, and this time the fog had changed. Shapes moved within it, blue lights pulsing like heartbeats, just out of reach. He could hear the crackle of police radios, the crunch of boots on gravel. They were coming for him. He slammed the doors shut and threw his weight against them, barricading them with his body. But when he turned around, Benny was there, sitting calmly in the center of the lobby like he'd been waiting forever. This place only holds what you bring into it, the boy said. And you brought a lot. The knocking was getting louder now, not just from the walls, but from the ceiling, the floor, everywhere at once. Thump, 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 like the heartbeat of a dying man. Make it stop, Lionel begged. The sound was driving him mad. He couldn't think, couldn't breathe. The small fist seemed to be beating from inside his own skull now. He ran. Panic took over as he burst through the stairwell door, taking the rusted steps 2 at a time. Behind him, the knocking followed, echoing off concrete walls like gunshots. His foot caught on a piece of twisted rebar jutting from the crumbling steps. He fell hard. The jagged steel tore through his pants and bit deep into his thigh. Blood bloomed dark against the fabric as he tumbled down the remaining steps, finally coming to rest on the cold basement floor. Pain shot through his leg like lightning. When he tried to stand, his knee buckled. The wound was deep, deeper than he'd thought. Blood pooled beneath him on the concrete. He dragged himself into what looked like a sub-basement, leaving a dark trail behind him. The walls here were covered in children's drawings, dozens of them, flickering in the dim light filtering down from above. They all depicted the same figure. Him. Stealing. Lying. Help me, he gasped into the darkness. Please, I can't do this. Help me. Footsteps echoed on the stairs above, small footsteps coming slowly down. Benny appeared at the bottom of the stairwell, calm and quiet. His eyes searched Lionel's face, then lowered to the wound. You remember what you did, Benny said softly. When your partner twisted his ankle, you didn't help him. Lionel tried to protest, but Benny cut him off with a tilt of his head. That same old gesture Lionel made when he was disappointed. And now you want sympathy. The words hit like a punch to the gut. Lionel doubled over, gasping. His throat tightened. Up close, he could see that the boy's eyes were older than they should be. Sadder than they should be. They were his own eyes, staring back at him across a lifetime of bad choices. You didn't help him, Benny continued relentlessly. You stood there and watched him crawl, watched him beg, and then you silenced him forever. He would have talked, Benny replied calmly. Would he? The question hung in the air, and for the first time, Lionel really considered it. Tommy Brennan had been in the business for 20 years. He'd done time before. Had he ever ratted anyone out? No, never. And now you want comfort, Benny said, his voice taking on Lionel's own cynical tone. Now you want someone to tell you it's going to be all right. Lionel whispered, Please, I can't do this. I can't. Benny cut him off. You said that last time. The words stopped Lionel cold. What? And the time before that. And the time before that. Benny circled him slowly, speaking in that familiar voice, Lionel's voice, worn down by years of excuses. You always say you want to change. You always promise you'll be better. And yet, here we are. Memory fragments began surfacing like bubbles in dark water. This building, this conversation, this same desperate bargaining. How many times had he been here? How many times had he run from consequence only to find himself face to face with the boy he used to be? This isn't the first time, Lionel breathed. No, Benny replied grimly. How many? Does it matter? The truth settled over Lionel like a weight he couldn't lift. This place, it wasn't real. Not entirely. It was something else, something born from guilt and memory and the part of his soul he'd tried to bury so deep it could never find its way to the surface. But it had found its way. It always found its way. Because that's what conscience does. It waits, it watches, and eventually it calls you home. The knocking stopped. The silence was deafening. I want to stop, Lionel said, his voice breaking. I want to stop stealing. Stop running. Stop. Killing? Benny asked. The word hung between them like a blade. Yes. Benny knelt beside him. For a moment, he looked like the child Lionel remembered, innocent and trusting and full of impossible hope. Then stop. It seemed so simple, yet Lionel could only manage to say, I don't know how. You do. Benny reached out and touched Lionel's face with small, cold fingers. You've always known. You just have to want it more than you want to survive. Lionel closed his eyes. When he opened them again, Benny was gone. But his voice remained, echoing from somewhere deep inside the building's bones. You always said you wanted to disappear. Lionel stood on shaking legs and walked to the front doors. His hand trembled as he reached for the handle. And now you can. The door opened. Sunlight streamed in, warm and golden and real. He stepped outside into a world that seemed newly made. The fog had lifted. The industrial district stretched before him, ordinary and solid and exactly as it should be. He was free. He limped through empty streets as the city woke around him, past storefronts and bus stops and people beginning their morning routines. No one looked at him. No one seemed to notice the blood on his clothes or the haunted look in his eyes. He passed a bakery and caught the scent of burnt cinnamon. The smell made him stumble, but he kept walking. At a newsstand, he tried to buy a paper. The vendor looked right through him. Lionel waved his hand in front of the man's face, but there was no reaction. He tried again at a coffee shop. The barista took other customers' orders, but never acknowledged his presence. He could stand right next to people, could shout in their faces, could wave his arms like a madman. Nothing. The truth settled over him slowly like dust on a forgotten grave. He was free, all right. Free from consequence, free from pursuit, free from the weight of existence itself. He had wished to disappear, and his wish had been granted. Lionel walked through the city for hours, a ghost in broad daylight, a shadow with substance but no presence, alone in his perfect invisible prison, forever. Benny's words echoed in his mind. You always said you wanted to disappear, and now you have. There are fates worse than death, and sometimes they wear the mask of answered prayers. Lionel Cates got exactly what he wished for. Escape from consequence, freedom from pursuit, the ultimate disappearing act. But in a universe where moral debts must eventually be paid, some prisoners discover that their cells have no walls, only mirrors. Perhaps true punishment isn't being seen for what you've done, but never being seen at all. There are men who believe themselves chosen by God to cleanse the world of its impurities. They speak of justice while wielding cruelty, of salvation while sowing destruction. But what happens when such a man discovers that the very corruption he seeks to purge has taken root in his own soul? Tonight, we witness the fall of a self-appointed savior whose vision of purity is really a glimpse into madness. Nathaniel Pruitt stood at the edge of Salem's town square, watching the morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones. His black coat hung perfectly pressed, his white collar unmarked by dust or doubt. He was a man of precision, a man of purpose, a man who believed himself chosen by the Almighty to serve as his instrument of judgment. The townsfolk whispered his name with a mixture of reverence and fear. Magistrate Pruitt, the witch hunter. The man who had sent 17 souls to their maker in the past year alone. 17, he murmured to himself, savoring the number like communion wine. 17 servants of darkness, purged from this godly community. His pale eyes surveyed the square where the stake still stood from yesterday's execution. Martha Hadley had been the latest, a spinster who had dared to question his methods in open court. She had called him cruel, called him merciless. Nathaniel's thin lips curved into what might have been a smile. Mercy was weakness. Mercy was the devil's tool. The sound of approaching footsteps drew his attention. Constable Hartwell emerged from the town jail, his weathered face grim with purpose. Magistrate Pruitt, Hartwell said, touching his cap. The witch Mercy Till is ready for sentencing. Nathaniel nodded slowly. Mercy Till, the herbalist who had lived on the outskirts of town for 30 years. A woman who had helped birth half the children in Salem, who had tended the sick, who had never spoken a crossword to anyone until yesterday. Yesterday, when young Timothy Morse had fallen ill with fever, and Mercy had given him a tonic that saved his life. But the boy had babbled in his delirium, babbled about seeing angels with black wings, about hearing voices in the forest. Clearly, the work of the devil. Nathaniel followed Hartwell into the dim stone building that served as their jail. The cells were small, cramped things, barely large enough for a man to lie down. In the furthest cell sat Mercy Till. She was smaller than Nathaniel remembered. Her gray hair hung in thin wisps around a face carved by 70 years of New England winters. Her hands, those terrible hands that had mixed potions and cast spells, rested quietly in her lap. She looked up as he approached, and Nathaniel was surprised to see no fear in her eyes. Only sadness. "Mercy Till," he began, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "You stand accused of practicing witchcraft, of consorting with the devil, of corrupting the youth of this godly community." She said nothing. "The evidence against you is overwhelming. Young Timothy Morse's own testimony, the strange herbs found in your dwelling, your unnatural knowledge of healing." Still, she remained silent. Nathaniel felt his anger rising. This was the moment they always broke, when faced with the righteous fury of God's chosen instrument. They pleaded, they begged, they confessed their sins and threw themselves upon the mercy of the court. But Mercy Till simply sat there, watching him with those calm gray eyes. "You will burn in 3 days' time," Nathaniel said finally. "May God have mercy on your soul." He turned to leave, but her voice stopped him. "Nathaniel Pruitt." Her voice contained a sense of power and contempt. He looked back, expecting to see terror, desperation, the usual last-minute attempt to bargain for life. Instead, Mercy Till was smiling. "You fear sin like a plague, don't you?" she said confidently. "You see it everywhere, in every shadow, in every kind word or gentle touch. You've spent your life trying to purge it from this world." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "I do God's work." Her smile widened. "Do you?" There was something in it that made his skin crawl. "Then let me view a gift, magistrate. Let me help you become what you've always claimed to be." She reached through the bars then, her aged fingers closing around his wrist with surprising strength. Her touch was cold. Cold as winter earth, cold as the grave. "You want to be the plague that cleanses sin from this world?" she whispered. "Then be the plague." Nathaniel jerked his hand away, his heart hammering against his ribs. Mercy Till's laughter followed him as he fled the jail, a sound like wind through dead leaves, like the whisper of flames consuming dry wood. That night, sleep brought no peace. He dreamed of fields, endless fields of withered corpses. The sky above was the color of ash, and the air tasted of copper and decay. He walked among the dead, and with each step more bodies appeared. Men, women, children, all twisted and blackened, their faces frozen in silent screams. And through it all, Mercy Till's laughter echoed like thunder. Nathaniel woke in a cold sweat, his nightclothes soaked with perspiration. Dawn was breaking through his bedroom window, painting the walls in shades of blood and gold. His wife Rebecca stirred beside him. "Nathaniel," she murmured, her voice thick with sleep. "Are you well?" He looked at her, really looked at her, and felt his heart clench. Rebecca, sweet, gentle Rebecca, who had never spoken a harsh word in her life, who had borne him 2 beautiful children and never questioned his work, never questioned his methods. "I'm fine," he whispered, reaching out to touch her face. The moment his fingers brushed her cheek, Rebecca's eyes went wide. Her mouth opened in a soundless scream, and before Nathaniel could pull away, her skin began to change. It dried, it withered, it cracked like old parchment. Rebecca's face collapsed inward, her eyes sinking into dark hollows, her beautiful auburn hair turning gray and brittle. In seconds, she was nothing but a husk, a dried shell of what had once been his beloved wife. Nathaniel screamed. He scrambled backward, falling from the bed, his hands shaking as he stared at what remained of Rebecca. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening. "Papa?" He turned to see his children standing in the doorway. Thomas, age 7, and little Mary, barely 4. Their faces were pale with confusion and fear. "Papa, what's wrong with Mama?" Thomas asked. Nathaniel tried to speak, tried to warn them away, but they were already running toward him, already reaching out with their small, trusting hands. "No," he whispered, "no, don't." But it was too late. The moment they touched him, the same terrible transformation began. His children, His beautiful, innocent children withered and died in his arms. Their warmth turned to ash. Nathaniel knelt there on the bedroom floor, surrounded by the remains of his family, and understood with crystal clarity what Mercy Till had done to him. He had become death itself. The next hours passed in a blur of horror. Nathaniel wrapped his hands in cloth and stumbled through the streets of Salem, seeking help, seeking answers, seeking some way to undo what had been done. But everywhere he went, death followed. Reverend Alder took one look at him and recoiled in terror. "Witchcraft," the old man hissed. "You've brought the devil's curse upon yourself." "Please," Nathaniel begged. "You have to help me. I didn't. This isn't what it seems." But Alder was already backing away, his face twisted with disgust and fear. "Stay away from me, you cursed thing. Stay away from all of us." Nathaniel fled into the forest, hoping that solitude might contain the horror he had become. But even nature rejected him. Birds fell from the trees at his approach. Flowers blackened and died. The very ground seemed to retreat from his footsteps. He was alone, completely and utterly alone. For 3 days, he wandered the wilderness, eating nothing, drinking nothing, sustained only by the terrible curse that had consumed his life. On the 4th day, desperation drove him back to Salem, back to the jail, back to Mercy Till. She was sitting in exactly the same position as before, her hands folded in her lap, her gray eyes calm and knowing. She looked up as he approached, and that same maddening smile crossed her face. "Magistrate Prewitt," she said pleasantly, "how nice to see you again." "Please," he whispered, pressing his cloth-wrapped hands against the bars. "Please, I beg you, lift this curse. I'll do anything you ask." Mercy Till's smile widened. "Anything?" "Yes. Free me." Nathaniel's heart leaped. Here was his chance, his one hope for redemption. All he had to do was unlock the cell, and surely God would forgive him. Surely the curse would be lifted. His hand moved toward the key ring at his belt, then stopped. What would the townspeople say? What would Reverend Alder think? His reputation, his standing in the community, his role as God's chosen instrument. "I can't," he whispered. Mercy Till's laughter filled the jail. "Of course you can't. You're still the same man, Nathaniel Prewitt. Still so proud, still so righteous, still so afraid of what others might think." "You're lying," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "The curse will lift when you die, when justice is served." "Will it?" She leaned forward, her eyes glittering in the dim light. "Tell me, magistrate, what makes you think this is about me at all?" The question hit him like a physical blow. He staggered backward, his mind reeling. I don't understand." "Don't you?" Mercy Till's voice was gentle now, almost motherly. "You've spent your entire life believing that sin was something outside yourself, something you could hunt down and destroy. But what if the real corruption was already inside you? What if it always had been?" Nathaniel shook his head frantically. No, I'm righteous. I'm chosen. I do God's work." "Whose work were you doing when you condemned 17 innocent people to die? Whose work were you doing when you ignored evidence of their innocence? Whose work were you doing when you chose pride over mercy, judgment over compassion?" The walls of the jail seemed to be closing in around him. Nathaniel could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears like a funeral drum. "You're wrong," he gasped. "You're wrong about everything." "Am I?" Mercy Till stood up, her frail form somehow radiating power. "Then prove it, magistrate. Show me your mercy. Show me your compassion. Set me free." But Nathaniel was already walking away, his footsteps echoing in the stone corridor. He could hear her laughter following him, could feel her eyes burning into his back. At dawn, they came for her. Nathaniel stood in the town square, surrounded by the people of Salem, and watched as Mercy Till was led to the stake. She moved with dignity, her head held high, her gray hair catching the morning light. As they bound her to the wooden post, she looked directly at him. "Last chance, magistrate," she called out. "Choose mercy." Nathaniel said nothing. The flames began to rise. Mercy Till never screamed, never begged, never showed any sign of pain or fear. She simply stood there, wreathed in fire and smoke, and laughed. It was the most terrible sound Nathaniel had ever heard. As the flames consumed her, he felt a surge of triumph. Surely now the curse would be broken. Surely now he would be free to resume his holy work. He reached out and grasped the shoulder of Constable Hartwell, who stood beside him. Hartwell's scream shattered the morning air. The man collapsed, his body withering and drying like autumn leaves. The crowd scattered in terror, but Nathaniel barely noticed. He was staring at Mercy Till's remains, at the charred bones and ash that had once been a woman. She was still laughing, not with her voice. Her voice was gone. But the laughter was there, echoing in his mind, reverberating through his soul. "You see?" Her voice whispered inside his head. "It was never about me. It was never about magic or curses or the devil. It was about you, Nathaniel Pruitt. It was always about you." The revelation hit him like lightning. The curse wasn't supernatural, it was spiritual. It was the physical manifestation of what he had always been, a bringer of death, a destroyer of innocence, a plague upon the world. Mercy Till hadn't cursed him. She had simply revealed him. The sound of approaching footsteps drew his attention. Reverend Alder stood at the edge of the square, flanked by a dozen armed men. Their faces were grim with purpose. "Nathaniel Pruitt," Alder called out, "by the authority of this godly community, I arrest you for the practice of witchcraft." Nathaniel almost laughed. The irony was perfect. He had spent his life hunting witches, and now he would die as one. They dragged him to the same cell where Mercy Till had waited for death. They bound his hands with iron shackles. They read him the charges in voices filled with righteous fury, and through it all, he could hear her laughter. That night, alone in the darkness, Nathaniel Pruitt finally understood the true nature of his curse. He had always believed himself chosen by God, but he had been wrong about which God. He was not an instrument of divine justice. He was a servant of something far darker. He had fed on fear and suffering for so long that he had become fear and suffering incarnate. The curse hadn't changed him. It had simply stripped away the lies he told himself. At dawn, they came for him. The townspeople gathered in the square, the same people who had once praised his righteousness, who had once called him a pillar of the community. Now they watched with hungry eyes as he was led to the stake. "I was chosen," he screamed as they bound him to the wooden post. "I was doing God's work. I was trying to save you all." But his words fell on deaf ears. The people of Salem had found their new witch, their new scapegoat, their new target for righteous fury. As the flames began to lick at his boots, Nathaniel felt a strange sense of peace. For the first time in his life, he was exactly where he belonged. The fire rose higher, and through the smoke and heat, he saw her one last time. Mercy Till, standing at the edge of the crowd, her gray hair flowing in a wind that touched no one else. She was smiling. "There," her voice whispered in his ear. "Now you understand." Nathaniel Pruitt died as he had lived, bound, burning, condemned by frightened people convinced they were righteous. But in his final moments, he heard something that surprised him. Laughter. His own laughter. The town square stood empty once more. Ash drifted through the morning air, carried by the autumn wind. The stake had been reduced to charred splinters, and the crowds had dispersed back to their daily lives. But in the silence that followed, something strange occurred. At the base of the blackened stake, where Nathaniel Pruitt's ashes had settled into the earth, a single flower began to bloom. A rose, black as midnight, its petals dried and withered yet somehow beautiful. It stood there for a moment, swaying in the breeze before crumbling to dust and blowing away. And in the distance, carried on the wind, came the sound of laughter. "Pride, they say, goeth before the fall. But what of the man who mistakes his fall for his rise? What of the soul so corrupted by its own righteousness that it can no longer distinguish between salvation and damnation?" In the end, Nathaniel Pruitt got exactly what he had always wanted, to be God's chosen instrument. He simply discovered too late which God had chosen him. The South Canadian River ran muddy and low that evening, its surface catching the last amber light of dusk like broken glass. Despite its name, the river was nowhere near Canada. It was the longest tributary of the Arkansas River, stretching over 1,000 miles from Colorado into Oklahoma. Leland Dorsey climbed up its banks and stumbled out of the tree line, his clothes torn and soaked through, river weeds clinging to his boots. Scratches crisscrossed his arms and face, some still bleeding fresh. He moved like a man walking through a nightmare he couldn't wake from. At his truck parked crooked on the gravel access road, Leland yanked open the tailgate with shaking hands. The cooler sat there, dented and crusted with dried mud. He flipped it open and grabbed a beer, then another, downing both in desperate gulps. The empty cans clattered into the truck bed where half a dozen others already lay scattered. The woods seemed to press closer in the gathering darkness. "Not gonna get me," he muttered, wiping beer foam from his mouth. "Not today." He climbed into the cab, hands still trembling as he turned the key. The engine coughed to life and he pulled away from the river, leaving deep ruts in the soft earth. In his mirrors, the water disappeared behind the trees, but he kept checking anyway. Something had happened down there by the water, something that made a man's eyes go hollow and his voice shake when he spoke. But the real horror was still to come. The Knox trailer sat at the end of a dirt road, surrounded by scrub oak and the kind of quiet that settles over small Oklahoma towns after dark. A yellow porch light cast sickly shadows across the gravel drive as Leland's truck pulled up, engine ticking in the silence. He sat for a moment, staring at the modest home. Through the lit windows, he could see movement. Jimmy's kids going about their evening routine, probably wondering when their father would come home from his fishing trip. Leland grabbed Jimmy's tackle box from the truck bed, along with a pair of mud-caked boots. The gear felt heavy in his hands, weighted with more than just river water and memories. The front door opened before he could knock. Jimmy's teenage daughter appeared first, her face lighting up with expectation. Behind her, the boy, maybe 16, peered over her shoulder. "Where's Dad?" the girl asked, looking past Leland toward the empty truck. Leland stood there, dripping river water onto their welcome mat. His eyes wouldn't meet theirs, fixed instead on some point beyond their shoulders. When he finally spoke, his voice was flat, matter of fact, like he was commenting on the weather. "He's not coming back." The daughter laughed, a nervous sound that died quickly when she saw his expression. The boy stepped forward, studying Leland's wild appearance, the scratches, the wet clothes, the hollow stare. "What do you mean?" the boy pressed. But Leland was already turning away, dropping the tackle box and boots on the porch with a dull thud. He walked back to his truck without another word, leaving Jimmy's children standing in the doorway, confusion turning to something darker as the silence stretched. The boy grabbed his mother's phone and dialed 911. Detective Calvin Ridge was 3 hours into a stack of paperwork when Deputy Sonia Rivas appeared in his office doorway, holding a call log that made her frown. "Teen called in something weird," she said, dropping into the chair across from his desk. "Says a man just told him his dad's not coming back. Kid described him as looking like he crawled out of the river." Ridge set down his pen, already feeling the familiar itch between his shoulder blades that came with cases that didn't add up. Man got a name? Leland Dorsey. Was supposed to be fishing with the missing man. Jimmy Knox. Rivas flipped a page. Gets better. Dorsey's own daughter just called. Says her dad came home talking about killing Jimmy. Ridge was already reaching for his jacket. 23 years in law enforcement, and he'd learned to trust that itch. People didn't usually announce murders unless they'd actually committed them. "Call Dale. Tell him to meet us at Dorsey's place," Ridge said, holstering his service weapon. "And Sonia, drive fast." Leland Dorsey's trailer sat on 5 acres of scrubland, the kind of property where a man could drink himself to death without bothering the neighbors. Ridge counted at least 20 empty beer cans scattered around the front porch as they pulled up, the headlights catching the aluminum like scattered coins. Dorsey himself sat in a lawn chair, surprisingly upright for a man who'd apparently been drinking all evening. He held a fresh beer but wasn't drinking it, just staring out into the darkness beyond the porch light's reach. Ridge and Rivas approached cautiously, hands near their weapons but not drawn. Dale Mercer's cruiser pulled up behind them, gravel crunching under his tires. "Leland Dorsey?" Ridge called out. "That's me." Dorsey's voice was steady, clear, not slurring, just empty. "We need to talk to you about Jimmy Knox." Without prompting, without even looking at them, Dorsey said, "I done it. Had to." The words hung in the night air like smoke. Ridge felt Rivas tense beside him, ready to move if Dorsey suddenly decided he didn't want to talk anymore. "What did you do, Leland?" Ridge kept his voice gentle, the way you'd talk to a spooked horse. For the first time, Dorsey looked directly at him. His eyes were bloodshot but focused, carrying a weight that made Ridge's skin crawl. "He was going to summon it. That thing. The tall one. I seen it watching us." Dorsey set down his beer with deliberate care. Had to stop him before it got us both. Rivas moved behind him, cuffs ready. Leland Dorsey, you're under arrest. Something in Dorsey's voice, in the way he'd said, "I done it," like he was reading from a grocery list. That was the sound of a man who knew exactly where the line was and crossed it anyway. The interview room at the Red Hawk Sheriff's Office smelled like disinfectant and bad coffee. Dorsey sat across from Ridge and Rivas, swaying slightly despite being stone sober now. His eyes kept drifting to the corners of the room, as if something might be lurking there. "Tell me about yesterday evening, Leland," Ridge said, keeping his voice neutral. "Start from when you and Jimmy got to the river." Dorsey's story came out in fragments, like pieces of a broken mirror that wouldn't quite fit together. He described Jimmy howling into a pipe, making sounds that weren't quite human. Claimed he saw something watching them from the tree line, a figure 12 feet tall with eyes that reflected light like an animal's. Jimmy was calling to it, Dorsey insisted, his voice gaining strength as he warmed to his tale. "Making that noise, that howl, I told him to stop, but he wouldn't listen. Said it was just fooling around, but I seen what was watching us." "So you attacked him?" Rivas asked. "Had to stop the summoning." Dorsey's matter-of-fact tone made Ridge's skin crawl. "Grabbed him around the throat. He fought some, but I held on." "And you held him down how long?" Ridge leaned forward. "I don't know, until he stopped making that noise." Rivas excused herself, hand over her mouth. Ridge stayed, watching Dorsey's face as he described choking the life out of his fishing partner. There was no remorse there, no recognition of what he'd really done. "You didn't stop a monster, Leland," Ridge said quietly. "You became one." Getting Leland Dorsey to explain where he'd left Jimmy Knox was like trying to nail down smoke. "The river took him," was all he'd say, rocking slightly in his cell. "Down where the water bends." Ridge organized a search team that included Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation agents and half the county's deputies. They worked through the night with flashlights and prayers, checking every bend and eddy along the South Canadian. By morning, they'd found nothing but beer cans and fishing line. It was the buzzards that finally gave Jimmy away. Late the next afternoon, a drone pilot spotted the dark birds circling a debris pile 2 miles downstream from where Dorsey claimed they'd been fishing. The body was caught in a tangle of fallen trees, waterlogged and starting to bloat in the Oklahoma heat. Ridge waded out to examine the corpse, the river water cold against his legs. Jimmy Knox had been a big man in life, but death and the river had reduced him to something pale and terrible. Bruises covered his throat and arms, and his fingernails were torn and bloody, signs of a fight. Ridge measured them with his eyes, exactly the width of human hands, thumbs positioned just where the deepest impressions marked the throat. "Matches what he told us," Ridge said to Mercer as they waited for the medical examiner. "Grabbed him around the throat, held on until he stopped squirming." Mercer surveyed the debris-choked bend where they'd found the body, then glanced nervously at the tree line. "Well, I'll keep an eye out for Bigfoot, just in case. In case Dorsey was only half crazy." Ridge didn't laugh. The evidence was clear enough. No mythical creature had done this. Just a man with both hands and a mind too fried to know the difference between reality and delusion. The medical examiner's report confirmed what Ridge already knew. Jimmy Knox had died from prolonged manual strangulation. The bruising patterns were consistent with someone gripping his throat for several minutes, long enough to crush the windpipe and cut off blood flow to the brain. Toxicology came back more interesting. Methamphetamine in Dorsey's system, high levels, enough to fuel paranoid delusions, but not enough to completely disconnect him from reality. But the blood work only told part of the story. The forensic psychiatrist painted a more complex picture during her evaluation. Years of drug and alcohol abuse had fundamentally altered Dorsey's brain chemistry, creating a maze of damaged neural pathways where reality and hallucination intertwined. His prefrontal cortex showed signs of severe deterioration. The part of the brain responsible for impulse control and rational decision-making had been slowly poisoned by decades of substance abuse. This isn't a case of someone choosing to be evil, Dr. Jody Green explained to Ridge during her consultation. Leland Dorsey is a victim of severe chronic mental illness exacerbated by substance abuse. His perception of reality has been fundamentally compromised. When he saw that creature in the woods, his damaged mind genuinely believed it was there. She paused, reviewing her notes. The tragedy is that underneath the addiction and psychosis, there's likely a person who never wanted to hurt anyone. But years of self-medication for untreated mental health issues created a perfect storm. Drug-induced paranoia layered on top of existing psychological damage. Not full psychosis, but close enough. He was scared, delusional, living in a reality none of us can fully comprehend. Yes, he still retained some awareness of right and wrong, but that awareness was filtered through a mind that could no longer distinguish between genuine threats and chemical phantoms. Ridge interviewed Jimmy's son again, taking detailed notes about Dorsey's demeanor when he delivered the news. It was the way he said it, the boy explained, his mother's arm around his shoulders. Like he was telling us the sky was blue. No emotion, no nothing. He said it like it was a fact, like we already knew. Dorsey's daughter painted a similar picture. He said it 5 times that night after he got home. I killed Jimmy. I had to. Like he was trying to convince himself it was true. District Attorney Lydia Marsh was a practical woman who'd prosecuted enough murder cases to know when the facts spoke for themselves. She met with Dorsey's court-appointed attorney in her office, surrounded by case files and coffee cups. Your client confessed to multiple people, she pointed out. He led us to the body. The physical evidence is overwhelming. The defense attorney, a young public defender named Gary Bradley, looked tired already. He was suffering from drug-induced paranoia. He genuinely believed he was defending himself against some kind of supernatural threat. Doesn't matter what he believed, Marsh replied. What matters is he knew choking Jimmy Knox would kill him, and he did it anyway. Bradley waived the jury trial, fearing that 12 citizens would focus more on the Bigfoot delusion than the underlying mental health issues. Judge Patricia Hendricks approved the bench trial, and preparations began in earnest. Ridge spent hours organizing his notes, ensuring the timeline was bulletproof. The psychiatrist would testify that meth fueled Dorsey's delusions, but not enough to qualify for an insanity defense. He believed the story, sure, Ridge told Marsh during prep, but he also knew how to finish it. The courtroom was nearly empty on the morning of Leland Dorsey's trial. A few reporters, Jimmy's family, and the usual collection of courthouse regulars filled the gallery. Dorsey sat beside his attorney, dressed in an orange jumpsuit, staring straight ahead with the same hollow expression he'd worn since his arrest. Judge Hendricks called the court to order, and the prosecution began building its case. Marsh laid out the facts methodically. The fishing trip, the confession, the discovery of the body. Each piece of evidence clicked into place like bullets in a chamber. The defense leaned heavily on the tragic deterioration of Dorsey's mental state. Bradley painted a picture of a man whose mind had been slowly destroyed by years of untreated mental illness and subsequent self-medication through drugs and alcohol. Your Honor, Bradley said during his opening, Leland Dorsey didn't commit murder out of malice or evil intent. He is a victim of a mental health system that failed him, a victim of addiction that consumed his ability to perceive reality, a victim of brain damage so severe that he genuinely believed he was fighting for his life against a supernatural threat. The man sitting before you today is not the man he was before years of substance abuse rewired his brain and distorted his reality. Bradley presented evidence of Dorsey's deteriorating mental state over the past decade. Emergency room visits for panic attacks, neighbors reporting him talking to invisible people, his own family's desperate attempts to get him treatment that never materialized due to lack of resources and insurance coverage. This is what untreated mental illness looks like when it collides with methamphetamine psychosis, Bradley continued. Leland Dorsey made a tragic mistake while his damaged mind was trapped in a chemical nightmare. The real crime here is that we as a society failed to help him before it reached this point. But when Ridge took the stand, his testimony cut through the psychiatric explanations like a blade. He told me Jimmy was howling to call the monster, Ridge said, consulting his notes. Said he had to make sure Jimmy couldn't do it again. That's not fear talking. That's intent. Marsh's closing argument was simple and devastating. There was a monster in the woods that night, Your Honor. But it wasn't Bigfoot. It was the man sitting right here in this courtroom. The real monster in this case is Leland Dorsey. Judge Hendricks deliberated for less than an hour. When she returned to the bench, her expression gave nothing away. The defendant has admitted to causing the death of Jimmy Knox through manual strangulation, she began. While the court acknowledges the defendant's impaired mental state due to drug and alcohol abuse, this does not rise to the level of legal insanity. Ridge watched Dorsey's face as the words washed over him. No reaction, no recognition, just that same empty stare. The court finds Leland Dorsey guilty of murder in the first degree and sentences him to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The bailiff moved to escort Dorsey from the courtroom. As he passed Ridge's seat, their eyes met for a moment. Ridge saw nothing there, no remorse, no understanding of what he'd lost or taken. Just emptiness, like looking into a well at midnight. Jimmy's family embraced in the front row, tears mixing relief with grief. They had their justice, but it wouldn't bring back a husband and father who died for the crime of making noise by a river. Ridge found himself walking along the South Canadian River a week later. The case haunted him. The senselessness, the insanity. He couldn't shake it. As he followed the same path where Dorsey and Knox had fished their last time together, he wondered what must have gone through Jimmy's mind as his high school friend turned on him. It was almost too much for Ridge to contemplate. The woods were quiet, peaceful. The sound of moving water and wind through the trees were relaxing. No monsters lurked in the shadows, and no Bigfoot watched from the tree line. Leland Dorsey wasn't wrong about monsters, Ridge thought as he drove away. He was just looking to the wrong place.